In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to paint the poster boys of the Dawn of War PC game series, or the Thieves of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, delete as appropriate, the Blood Ravens. Now, I'm really excited for this tutorial. I love this chapter. I love the games. So let's get painting. First up, I've primed the model black. Now, you may wonder what those lumps are on the shoulder pads. That is some masking putty, because the first thing I did was spray everything Zandri Dust. Now, the sane amongst you will leave the shoulder pads off, but I was so excited to build my 9 million Space Marine, I glued them on, and then I had to come up with a solution to getting them all sprayed. So I sprayed it Zandri Dust, covered the pads with some putty, and then sprayed the model black. Now, I am loath to recommend a single paint, but in this case, I have to recommend Burnt Red from Pro Acryl. The colour is absolutely perfect for Blood Raven's armour, so I'm going to use this to base all of the armour. Now, if you have an airbrush, great, it'll speed things up quite a lot. Otherwise, I'm going to apply this one with a brush. Now, this goes on really easily. I've thinned it down with a little bit of water. Now, it will take 2 coats, which is why I recommend the airbrush. And I said just now, I am loath to recommend a particular brand. I do use predominantly Citadel paints in my tutorials, and the reason for that is it's the most available paint. There are alternatives. There is a conversion chart in the description, and I also get sent lots of paints to try. Where I find ones which are better than Citadel, I will use those and I will recommend them. It's just that this particular colour is perfect. Next up, I'm going to paint in all of the black, and I'm using black from AK. So again, if you used an airbrush or you've been a little bit sloppy, you can tidy that up now. So I'm painting things like the chest eagles. I'll rebase the weapon, and I'm also going to paint all of the under armour, the ribbing between all of the joints of the model. I also want to get the rim of the shoulder pads painted, because that's a black trim. So you're just going to need to be a little bit careful when you do this. So make sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush and you've got a good tip on there, and just take your time painting in the trims. Now, if you do make any mistakes, you can paint over it with Zandri Dust, because we haven't started highlighting these bits yet. And that, again, that's an easy process, but you will need 2 coats of Zandri Dust. So the more careful you are with the black, the less time it'll take you overall. I'm going to base all of the metallics next, and the colour I'm using is Surcoats Silver from the Too Thin Coats range. Now, you can use lead belcher, you can use dark aluminium from Vallejo, whatever you prefer. I've just found that with a little bit of water, this flows nicely and covers fantastically well. As you know, I think it's probably neck and neck with dark aluminium, but I'm out to that at the moment, so I'm going to stick to Surcoats for the base. I'll then wash all of the silver using some Nuln Oil. This is nice and straightforward, nothing flashy. Just try not to spill it on that red armour. Don't worry too much if you do get it on some of the edges of the black, because we will be highlighting that soon. Whilst I'm waiting for that Nuln Oil to dry, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do all of the shading. So it's not really shading, it's kind of just painting in those lines and those joint recesses. And I'm using Black Templar contrast paint for this. I'm using it neat and making sure I've got a really good tip on my brush so that I can be really, really accurate. Now, a much faster way of doing this would be to use an oil wash, and that's perhaps one of the negative things about the Pro Acryl paints, is that they're so matte that when you put an oil wash on them, they just absorb the oil and it doesn't flow particularly well into the recesses. Now, of course, you can get around this by putting a gloss varnish or a satin varnish over the model, but then you've got to go back and dull it down afterwards. So for me, I'm just going to take my time and work around the model, putting all this black lining in using Black Templar contrast paint. But if you want to use an oil wash, or you want to use something like Nuln Oil, probably put a satin or gloss coat down first. Next up, I'm going to base all of the gold. Now, there's not a huge amount of gold on this model, but if you are be painting something a bit more fancy, like a captain or a lieutenant model, then you will have a bit more gold. So the colour I'm using is Dragon's Gold, again from Too Thin Coats paint. I'm really enjoying this range at the moment in terms of the metallics. If you haven't got this, you can use something like Retributor Armour, which will work perfectly fine. I'm then going to shade all of the gold using Reikland Fleshshade. Again, nothing fancy with this. Just make sure you work it into those recesses and take your time when you're applying it, particularly over parts you've already finished, and try not to spill it on any silver because it will stain it. I'm then going to highlight all of the gold using white gold from Pro Acryl, which is a very, very bright highlight. Now, normally I'd use something like Liberator Gold from Citadel, but because there's so little gold on this model, I didn't want to waste too much time working up through the highlights. Just went straight to the top highlight. And this will just help it reflect a little bit and stand out, so you can actually make out there are gold parts on the tabletop. If you haven't got white gold, just mix a little bit of a bright silver into something like Liberator Gold, and that'll work perfectly well. To highlight all the silver, I just use some chrome from Vallejo Model Air. Now, this is a very, very bright silver. You can use something like Stormhose silver if that's what you've got. And all I needed to do was make sure I got a very, very small amount on my brush, very good tip, and just drag it along those sharp edges. And this gives me a nice, crisp, metallic highlight. So I'll move on to the leather, and the colour I'm going to use for that is Dryad Bark, which is a nice desaturated brown. It really fits in with the overall aesthetic of the Blood Raven armour, which is a little bit worn, quite desaturated. I think this brown works perfectly as a base for all of the leather. To highlight all of the leather, I took some Gorthor Brown, which is a slightly lighter desaturated brown than the Dryad Bark from the last step. And I just painted this along the edges, using the shape of the model to guide the brush to get a nice crisp highlight. I also use this Gorthor Brown to base any scroll work, and if you've got purity seals on the model, you can use it to base those as well. Now, this model has got a little bit of a decorative tassel across his shoulder pad, so I'm going to base that with Screamer Pink. Now, if this was over the red armour, I might use a bone colour to do this, but because it's on the lighter bone, I'm just going to use some Screamer Pink to help it stand out. So this is a nice easy step of basing it. When that Screamer Pink is dry, you can shade it using some Nuln Oil. Again, this is nice and straightforward. You just need to brush it over the paint from the previous stage. Just be careful not to spill it on any of the brighter parts of armour. Finally, I'll take a little bit of pink horror and just dab this on the cord, leaving the darker colours in the recesses, and this gives me a nice easy highlight. Again, the key to this is making sure you haven't got too much paint on your brush, and then you've got a really good tip. To get that tip, just as you put it out to the paint, just rotate the brush a little bit and you'll get that nice sharp point. To paint any scroll work or purity seals that you've got on the model, I'm now going to take a little bit of Reikland Flesh and just paint this over the Gorthor Brown we did a few steps ago. Now, the reason I use the Gorthor Brown is because it's going to provide a nice base that's not too difficult to cover using the Reikland Flesh. So we're going to use the Gorthor Brown in the recesses and just start to highlight using the Reikland Flesh. When we're happy with that highlight, we'll take some Pallid Witch Flesh, which is a much brighter colour. And again, we're just going to use this across those edges. So make sure you haven't got too much on your brush, a nice sharp point, and just pull it along the sharp edges to get a nice crisp highlight. To highlight all of the black, we'll start with Old Faithful Mechanicus Standard Grey. So we don't want too much on our brush. We want a very good tip. You probably guess it's a theme now of how I paint, and I would encourage you to practice painting as well. And we're just going to use this to catch all of the sharp parts of black. So we're looking at the chest eagle, we're looking at the casing for the bolt weapon, and also that shoulder pad trim. So just work your way around, be very careful, dragging that brush along the edges. And if you do put it on a bit too thick, you can always fix it with some black paint. The final bright highlight on that black is going to be with Administratum Grey. And this, again, is a very straightforward step as long as you haven't got too much paint on your brush. And what we're looking to do is kind of refine this and keep it within the Mechanicus Standard Grey of the last step. And we also just want to focus it more towards the sharp edges and sharp corners. So we won't highlight every single edge with this. We'll just push it to those extremities that are going to catch the most light. To highlight the shoulder pads, we're going to take a 50-50 mix of Ushabti Bone and Zandri Dust. And this is going to make it much easier to cover. So we'll just paint this probably over the top half of the shoulder pad, the bit that's going to catch the most light, which means we'll leave the Zandri Dust in the recesses underneath. Now, you may need to take a little bit of extra Zandri Dust just to smooth that transition a bit, but you be the judge of what you're happy with. The reason we've mixed two paints together is because it's going to brighten it, but it makes it a lot easier to get decent coverage. To finish that up, we'll put a sharp highlight in using Screaming Skull, which is a much brighter bone colour. And we're just going to make sure we've got a very good tip on the brush and paint this just across from where the shoulder pad insert meets the trim. And again, this will just help draw the eye and give us a nice effect on the model. The last thing we need to do is highlight the armour. So the first highlight we're going to use is Wazdakka Red. Now, it goes without saying, if you need to go back and fix the armour because you made mistakes, do that first. But then we're just going to take some Wazdakka Red and we're going to use this to highlight all of the edges. So where we can, we're just going to draw the brush across them, such as across the knee, down the edge of the greave, across the front of the gorget. Again, nice and simple, letting the model do most of the work by dragging the brush across it. Where we can't do that, such as on some of the armour joints and some of the recesses, we just want to take our time and paint some nice sharp lines in. Again, we can always go back and correct it with some burnt red if we do make any mistakes. The final highlight on the armour and the thing that's going to bring this entire model together is some Squig Orange, which is a nice kind of darkish, desaturated, reddy orange colour. And again, we're going to go for the same prescription of a good tip on your brush, not too much paint, a little bit of water to thin it down. And we're going to drag this across the most prominent edges. Now, we're going to keep this inside the Wazdakka Red from the previous stage, and that's going to help in terms of a highlight transition and also help it stand out on the tabletop. So if you're not sure, just follow the pictures that you'll see on the turntable. You can just pause the video and see where all those highlights are applied. But just work your way over the model. Use it fairly sparingly to start with. You can always go back and add more later. Now, this Blood Raven is done, and I'm really, really happy with how he's turned out. You're probably wondering how to paint the face. Well, if you need to do that, check out this video here where I walk you through the most basic and easy techniques to get some good looking skin on your Space Marines. I thank you so much for watching. Please make sure you like the video, and if you haven't already yet, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time.